Poundridge lies within the ancestral lands of the Ramapo-Munsee, a sub-tribe of the Lenape. The Ramapo-Munsee are proud to be the original keepers of the land and continue to recognize an inherent responsibility to protect it. In 1644, Captain John Underhill led troops to attack and murder 700 or more members gathered from different tribes somewhere in the area. In a variety of ways, the Ramapo were pushed off the land. Some continue to live nearby in southern New York and northern New Jersey. Those of us living in Poundridge today cannot undo a tragedy, but we can acknowledge the history and enduring relationship of the Ramapo to this land. We can work toward building a relationship with the Ramapo, commit to diversity and inclusion, and demonstrate a shared responsibility for the land through a renewed and strengthened commitment to the long-term care of the environment. This brings us to tonight's program, Significant Habitats in the Town of Poundridge. A habitat is a place where an organism makes its home. It's not as simple as a den or a hollow log. A habitat has to meet all the environmental conditions for an organism's survival. For an animal, that means everything needed to find and gather food, store it for the winter, shelter to survive storms and winter, select a mate, successfully reproduce, and then be able to raise the young. The main components of a habitat are shelter, water, food, and a place to raise the young. So a habitat goes far beyond a bird's nest. Okay? Tonight we're going to hear about the identification and mapping of habitats in Poundridge that took place in 3 studies between 2017 and 2021. Funding reached $70,000. It was ambitious, and it came from grants from New York State DEC, from Westchester Community Foundation, contributions by the town of Poundridge, the Conservation Board, Aquarian Water Company, Henry Morgan Love Reserve, Poundridge Land Conservancy, Rock River Country Club, Wellspring Monastery, and large and small donations from individuals, some of whom might be here, whose names are listed in the 2021 document. Again, I express my gratitude to each and every one who helped make this happen. Just a little bit more. In a hot minute, an interesting wildlife sighting in Poundridge it's posted, tweeted, texted, and shared. A fox trotting to the market. Did you see that one recently? The video of a fox going right into the market. A bald eagle at Trinity. I think John shared that one with me. A bobcat at a bird feeder. To protect the wild things, we must protect all the different habitats in Poundridge. Hudsonia, founded in 1981, is a well-respected not-for-profit institute for research, education, and technical assistance in the environmental sciences. The results of their study will be useful for decades to come to homeowners who can identify nearby habitats and landscape their properties in a way to connect to the habitats, to Planning and Zoning Board and Water Control Commission, who make discretionary decisions to balance human wants and environmental needs, to the Conservation Board that serves in an advisory capacity. The report is online on the Conservation Board webpage, and hard copies will be here in the library. Okay. I'm pleased to introduce you to the Hudsonia biologists presenting tonight. Gretchen, okay, who's the director of the Biodiversity Resources Center. Gretchen has 35 years of experience in remote sensing, habitat assessments, habitat mapping, rare plant surveys, and other field biology in the Northeast. She's the author of the Biodiversity Manual for the Hudson River Estuary Corridor. We're in that part of it. We're also in the one on the South watershed. And A Beginner's Guide to the Wildflowers of the Northeast. She's authored numerous technical reports reports and biological assessments, rare plant surveys, and other subjects. Okay. And Christopher Graham. Christopher is the field botanist. I trooped through some of the sites with Chris, have the privilege of doing that. His background is in plant community ecology. He works on the habitat mapping projects and on floristic surveys. He's interested in rare species conservation, community description and classification, and the effects of global change on plant communities and other topics. Okay. Chris also has the distinction of having made it in our police report because his car would be parked on the side of the road. And you know Boundbridge. That means somebody calls the police and they come out and I would read about it in the record review and send it to Chris. So with that, I turn the program over to Gretchen.
Thank you, Carrie. It should have been reassuring to you, Carrie, that the work was proceeding.
Absolutely, I knew.
I warned everybody in my neighborhood. Well, thank you, Carrie. That introduction said much of what I would have said here, but can people hear me through this?
Yes.
Okay, and tell me to speak up if you can. I sometimes start talking very, very softly. We're going to talk tonight about the habitats of Boundbridge, some aspects of their ecological values, their services to the human community, and what the people of Boundbridge themselves can do to protect the places that may be most important. This is a study. It took us 3+ years to complete. It actually has slides about the funding and the assistance. Carrie Sears is the person who conceived and initiated the project. She found all the funding from many sources, and we also had lots of help from other conservation board members and other organizations in town. And many individuals, including landowners, who very kindly allowed us to walk on their land so that we could see what we needed to see to be able to understand and describe the habitat. The funding was from the DEC and the Westchester Community Foundation. Those were the two largest sources. But we also had funding from many other individuals and organizations, and we're very grateful for that. The purpose of the project was to gather information that would help the town identify the areas of the greatest ecological importance so that the town could develop their own conservation goals and establish policies and practices to protect biodiversity and water resources. We ended up preparing this map. We have a printed version of it here, and quite an extensive report that describes the habitats, their ecological values, their sensitivities to disturbance from human activities, and provides lots of recommendations for conservation.
And there are some reports on the front table.
Yes.
There.
Well, yes. Those are all spoken for.
But if you want to peruse,
Yeah.
people want to peruse.
That's right. As Carrie mentioned, the report is available on the Conservation Board page of the town website. My colleagues, Chris Graham and Elise Heffernan, did most of the work on this project. And Chris will, in just a minute, will tell you about what they found and what are the implications for land uses in town. I think that is all that I needed to say. I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Thank you, Gretchen. I'm Chris Graham. I'll get right into it. So, first, why are habitats important? Well, functioning ecosystems are what we depend on for clean drinking water, oxygen to breathe, flood attenuation, climate moderation, and a host of other services. We can't always predict the consequences of the decline or loss of a single species or habitat, but we do know that the cumulative effect of land use without conservation planning is to decrease the land's ability to support natural communities and ourselves. We take a habitat approach versus looking at specific species for several reasons. First, a habitat is simply a place, it's the environment where an organism lives and uses for, that it uses for one or more of its life history needs, such as nesting, or foraging, breeding, or overwintering. Habitats make very good surrogates for species, for communities, for biodiversity. Once you know what kinds of habitats you have in an area, it often gives you a very good idea of what kinds of plants and animals may be living there or using that area. Conversely, habitat loss and degradation are the leading causes of species declines and extinctions worldwide. Non-biologists can readily recognize lots of habitats, things such as hardwood forest, upland meadows, marshes, ponds. These are terms that most of us are familiar with and bring up clear images to most of us. So they're easy to work with for planning agencies. They're also discrete stationary units. They don't move around or change very quickly, and so they're easy, in most cases, they're easy to incorporate into local ordinances and site designs. We mapped and studied ecologically significant habitats in this project. What we mean by that are everything from rare or declining or uncommon habitats, habitats that support declining or rare species, all the way to the most common habitats that we can see almost everywhere, forests and meadows and marshes, lakes, that really dominate the landscape. What we don't include in significant habitats are developed areas. Most lawns are not included for our purposes, and slivers of habitat that are sandwiched in between developed areas. So we did cover the whole town of Pound Ridge. It's almost 15,000 acres in this study. It includes an abundance of privately and publicly owned lands. This map shows Pound Ridge with major streams, water bodies, and roads marked, shown and labeled. The dark red blobs indicate areas for public recreation, parks and preserves, or Pound Ridge, for example, which dominates the northern end of the town. The town is broken into two watersheds. This red squiggly line is the dividing line. North of that, streams and rivers drain into other streams and rivers that ultimately flow into the Hudson River. And south of that, the streams and rivers ultimately feed the Long Island Sound. There are large areas of undeveloped land in Pound Ridge, as many of you know, which are regionally significant and critical habitat for a lot of the biodiversity of the southern Hudson Valley. So we do this work by beginning in the lab, in the office. We assemble a number of remote data sources. mostly on a computer, sometimes paper maps, but we bring together topographic maps, soils maps, geology maps, and aerial photographs on a computer and bring them all together in what's called a GIS program, Geographic Information System. This allows us to overlay them on top of each other, turn them on and off as we need to, and compare them. And from there, this shows an aerial photograph of part of the town of Pound Ridge, and we use all those data sources to delineate preliminary habitat boundaries, where we think the boundaries of different habitats might be, and that's shown in the yellow lines. So it's a prediction, but often with most habitats, we can make very good predictions from these remote sources about what habitats are actually out there. There are certain kinds of habitats that we need to see in the field to identify things that require us to look at the plant communities. We'll talk about those later. So once that's done, we go out in the field with the preliminary maps and we field check them. We answer any questions that we might have had. We confirm the habitat type. We check the boundaries of the habitats. We take down basic descriptions of the vegetation and habitat condition, invasive species, etc. Questions we might be asking in the field are, is there a vernal pool in this area? Are there a lot of rock outcrops here? Is this boundary correct for this marsh? That kind of thing. So, what we found is that about 80% of Pound Ridge falls under ecologically significant habitats, meaning about 20% is developed areas. Of that 80% of undeveloped land, we walked almost half of it in doing our field work with, I forgot to say earlier, with the permission of landowners to walk their properties or on the copious public properties that Pound Ridge has. The most common type most common habitat type in Pound Ridge was upland hardwood forest, and which includes things like oaks, maples, hickories, beeches, forest dominated by deciduous trees. Nearly 70% about 2/3 of Pound Ridge is forested by either upland forest or forested swamps. So this is a reduction of the final habitat map, as Gretchen showed you earlier. We did print out full-size, poster-size maps, which are much easier to interpret. This little image is not going to be very easy to discern anything in, but for example, the green color which dominates this image is upland hardwood forest, and you can see it's quite abundant. It's the predominant habitat type. Let's see. So this shows a list of the habitat types we found in Pound Ridge, both upland and wetland. You see there are quite a few different types, and we'll discuss a few of those. Here's a zoomed in area of the habitat map. So what we do is we color code the habitats and we label them with abbreviations or codes so that you can tell what they are. For example, the UHF stands for Upland Hardwood Forest, and that is that green area that kind of surrounds everything. IWP stands for Intermittent Woodland Pool. This is a type of vernal pool surrounded by forest usually, and it's the purple symbol. Marsh, MA stands for marsh, that's the pink. The hatching, the black hatching, represents areas of what we call crest ledge talus. These are rocky areas with a lot of rock outcrops. The light blue lines are streams and small rivers. White areas are developed areas which we exclude from ecologically significant habitats. And the bright green lines here show parcel boundaries. So, as I said, upland forests really.
I'm sorry, the green lines,
They're parcel boundaries, tax parcel boundaries.
thank you.
Mhm. So the upland forest really dominated the landscape. Nearly 60% of Pound Ridge was upland forest. If you include the wetland forest, that's how you get to the 2/3 forested figure for the whole town. So upland forests support a number of species of conservation concern. These include various salamander species that use forests for summer resting, travel, and foraging. Eastern box turtle, which spends a lot of time foraging in upland forests. Various types of snakes, which hunt in upland forests. And songbirds, many of which spend their whole breeding lives in upland forests. Things such as wood thrush, scarlet tanager, warblers, mammals such as bear, fisher, bobcat, many other things that I'm leaving out. That's a box turtle in the upper right and a scarlet tanager there in the lower right. And all these pictures, I believe, were taken in Pound Ridge. So, upland forests provide numerous ecosystem services which benefit not only wildlife but humans. They are perhaps the most effective land cover for capturing rainwater and snowmelt, promoting infiltration of this water to the soil, and therefore preventing runoff and mitigating floods. They recharge groundwater, they filter water, they reduce soil erosion, and protect water quality. Upland forests also store large amounts of carbon, which is critical for climate regulation. Conservation measures that can be taken to help protect upland forests. We recommend that remaining large tracts of forest be considered a high priority areas for conservation. If the town is interested in conservation of forests. In such places, it's best to keep development close to existing roads, rather than, for example, siting houses at the ends of long driveways that go deep into the woods. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. A lot of habitat value can also be maintained by allowing deadwood and downwood and organic debris to remain as it is, not to clean up the forest. Now, one of our priority habitats for the town of Pound Ridge, these are habitats that are of particular conservation value, are large forests, of which Pound Ridge has an abundance. This is the red-shouldered hawk, which uses large forests. They provide habitat value for an array of species that need large areas of forest to maintain breeding populations, such as certain raptors like the red-shouldered hawk, mammals like bobcats and fishers. Many forest songbirds, as I mentioned before, are sensitive to forest edges and need large forests to breed. One of these is right here, the black-throated green warbler. However, forests everywhere are being fragmented by roads and buildings, driveways, utility corridors. This kind of development breaks habitats up into smaller pieces that are often not sufficient as habitat for a lot of these organisms that I've mentioned. So large forests are becoming increasingly important in the Northeast, where loss of extensive forests is largely driving decline of numerous species. So this map shows forests in Pound Ridge with lighter colors representing smaller patches or blocks of forest, and the darkest colors representing the largest blocks of forests. Pound Ridge, the largest forest block, the only one over 1,000 acres, is up at the Ward Pound Ridge Reservation, and that is over 3,000 acres in size. There are also 2 forest blocks of between 500 and 1,000 acres. One of them is here in southwestern Pound Ridge and includes the Zoffnast Preserve. Another is in eastern Pound Ridge, around the Sisquot Reservoir, a lot of water company lands in that area. Again, that's over 500 acres of forest. It's a bit fragmented, especially in the northwestern corner, but still quite a valuable large forest block. There are also 8 forest patches in Pound Ridge between 200 and 400 acres. One of those is a long forest along the Mianus River Gorge, which actually is contiguous with forests just outside of Pound Ridge, and forms an even larger patch of forest. Another of these is around the Trinity Lake and the Cross River Reservoir. There's a large forest patch. And this one actually, the Metropolitan Conservation Area Alliance, considers this to be one of the most important forest tracts in eastern Westchester County for songbirds, especially neotropical migrant songbirds who come here to breed. They have found, for example, Canada warbler, war-eating warbler, and cerulean warbler, all with breeding populations in this area, these forests around these 2 reservoirs. So that's a notable area and notable biodiversity there. The cerulean warbler in particular has one of the largest area requirements of our songbirds. So this shows all of those 200 to 400 acre, they're kind of medium-sized forest patches outlined in bright red. And you can see they're distributed throughout the town. Zoom in a little bit. And there's the cerulean warbler. That's one of the ones I mentioned that needs quite a large area of forest, and I believe it's a New York State species of special concern. So another of our priority habitats in Pound Ridge is crest ledge talus. These are rocky areas. Crest and ledge are really just different terms for different types of rock outcrops. Talus is a term for accumulation of small to boulder-sized rocks on slopes or at the base of slopes. You can see talus in this picture. In fact, you consider this talus. Large piece of bedrock. Now, species of conservation concern that use these rocky areas include numerous snakes, just a few here: rat snakes, eastern hognose snake, northern copperheads, all of which live in Pound Ridge. Use these sites for denning and basking. Songbirds such as horn-eating warbler and cerulean warbler preferentially breed around these areas. Small-footed bat, which is a New York State species of special concern, uses talus slopes to roost in the summer. It uses crevices in rocks and beneath rocks. Bobcats and fishers also use these for hunting, for traveling, for shelter. Now, a special subset of crest ledge talus is calcareous crest ledge talus. These are areas that have high pH, high calcium bedrocks such as limestone or marble. And we separate these out because there's a whole array of unusual and sometimes rare plants that preferentially grow in these places. They really require these calcium-rich rock outcrops. Things such as wild columbine, which is fairly common, maidenhair fern, also not uncommon, beautiful. Black cohosh, which is more uncommon, I'd say. We don't have that up in the Mid-Hudson Valley, where we live. It's kind of special to see it down here. And even rarer plants, preferentially grown in these calcareous areas. Numerous, let's see. Oh, so this shows the location of crest ledge talus in Pound Ridge. There's quite a lot of it. There are concentrations of it in the Ward Pound Ridge. You can see in the gray there, those are all rocky areas. It's quite a rugged place of many cliffs, impressive crest areas, large talus slopes. The Zoffnass Preserve is quite rocky. This area on the northern end of these reservoirs is quite rocky. Scattered about the whole town, really. And then the orange shows some of the calcareous crest ledge talus we mapped. We didn't map a great deal of this. We suspect there's more of it because this is one of the things you have to see in person to identify. These are two of the larger areas that we mapped. They're both in bedrock, marble bedrock. There's a strip of marble bedrock in this part of the Pound Ridge. So we recommend, as far as conservation measures, maintaining forested corridors among rocky outcrops, rocky habitats, trying to protect the large forests around outcrops because a lot of the organisms that use the rocky areas need to travel through the forest or they need to use the forest for different parts of their life cycles. And trying to minimize human trampling of rocky areas, construction of roads or driveways or other areas through them, other direct disturbance. Let's move on now to Pound Ridge wetlands. Is there a clock in here? What time am I meant to end? 45? Okay. No. So we mapped several wetland types in Pound Ridge. We don't do jurisdictional wetland delineations in our work. We use aerial photographs and plant communities in the field, in our field work, and the presence of water or wet soils to make sketches of wetlands. But they're not official wetland delineations. I thought I should point that out. So this lists some of the wetland types that we mapped throughout Pound Ridge. A lot of these are all pretty common ones. We also mapped these vernal pools, fens, streams. I'll cover a couple of these in detail, but we won't have time to get into most of them today. So swamps are another one of those common matrix habitats. They cover a large part of the landscape. These are wetlands dominated by woody vegetation, trees, and or shrubs. We have hardwood swamps, mixed forest swamps, which include conifers like hemlocks or white pines, in addition to the hardwoods, and shrub swamps, which are shrub-dominated wetlands. So swamps support numerous species of conservation concern, plants such as purple milkweed, which is shown in the picture, swamp cottonwood, state threatened, which we found in Pound Ridge, found a new population of that. Winged monkey flower, which is, I think the Hudson Valley is a hot spot for it. Animals of conservation concern. Numerous turtles such as wood turtle, spotted turtle, box turtle, all of which use swamps for summer foraging, for drought refuge, travel corridors. Numerous birds nest in swamps. Red-shouldered hawk, for example, American black duck, Kentucky warbler, Canada warbler, white-eyed vireo, all nest in or around swamps. And most of these do occur in Pound Ridge, all of them could. Swamps provide ecosystem services much like upland forests do. They are excellent at water storage and therefore flood control. They filter water. They help provide clean water for us. They are also important for climate regulation, especially the deeper peats that accumulate, peat soils that accumulate in a lot of our older swamps in sort of large quantities of carbon. So in Pound Ridge, we mapped about 1,500 acres of swamps. which amounted to about 10% of the study area. They're shown in this brown color on this map. A lot of specks, you'll see. It's, from what we can see in this picture. The largest one is about 115 acres along the Stonehill River, here at the base of the Pound Ridge, the Ward Pound Ridge Plateau, if you would. And oh yeah, there it is. So that's the largest swamp in town. There are several others that are quite large. There's another one of 80 plus acres. I want to move on to intermittent woodland pools. This is one of our priority habitats because it does support numerous species of conservation concern, and it is vulnerable, quite vulnerable to development. This is an intermittent woodland pool or a vernal pool in the spring when it's full of water. Vernal pools are shallow, seasonal, fish-free pools. They manage to usually not have fish because they dry out in the late summer, and because they're isolated from other larger water bodies. So fish can't get there, and if they do, they will die because the pools dry out in most years. Because of this, because there are enough fish, they are able to support numerous amphibians that breed in these pools and really specialize in them. Marble-spotted Jefferson salamanders, another one called the blue-spotted salamander, wood frog. These species usually aren't able to maintain populations in other types of wetlands because of the fish. Here's a vernal pool later in the summer after it's dried out. So this is a good chance to introduce habitat complexes and conservation zones. Let's see. A lot of kinds of wildlife use multiple types of habitats during different parts of their life cycle. Different life needs such as foraging, breeding, sheltering, overwintering require different habitats. Therefore, to protect many species, you don't just need to protect kind of the core breeding habitat, you also need to protect surrounding or nearby habitats. For example, these pool breeding amphibians spend most of the year when they're not breeding in the spring in the surrounding upland forests. So to protect them and conserve them, you really need to protect the upland forest around them. Now, biologists have determined that the area within about 750 feet of a vernal pool is critical habitat, if it's upland, if it's forest, for these pool breeding amphibians. And so, therefore, to encompass this area, this critical habitat, in this complex of habitats, we designate what we call a conservation zone, which is 750 feet out from the pool edges. So this map shows all of the pools in Pound Ridge, 165 that we found. There probably are others because these are difficult to map from aerial photos. These include a few different types of pools, which we won't have time to differentiate right now. They also include groupings or complexes of pools, which happen when multiple pools are within that 750 feet of each other. So a pool complex includes a bunch of pools and the surrounding forest in between them. And in this map, the pools are little green flecks, which are hard to see. I'll zoom in a minute. The pool conservation zones are these light green blobs, which include the upland forests around them. Here's a pool complex of several pools. There's another one with, I think, 9 pools. I'll zoom into one particularly impressive complex in the Ward Pound Ridge Reservation that encompasses 35 pools. And it's probably quite important for pool breeding amphibians. Here's one more in and around the Henry Morgenthau Preserve, which has 10 pools. So to protect these pools, we recommend, obviously, protecting the pools themselves. They're often overlooked during site planning and environmental review. and they're usually not included in official wetland maps. They're usually overlooked in these sources. We also recommend protecting all forests within 100 feet of the pools. And within that larger conservation zone of 750 feet, to try to consider any impacts of any roads or development or other activities, impacts that those might have on the pool, on those pools and the surrounding forest. So you're probably all familiar with, in spring, on a warm, wet spring evening, seeing hundreds or thousands of little frogs jumping across our country roads. Salamanders are also crawling across them. In the spring, these amphibians have to move from their forest home to the pools where they breed, and so they need to cross roads, and they are often subject to, they're very vulnerable to being run over by cars and often experience mass mortality. Therefore, the Conservation Board, the Pound Ridge Conservation Board, asked us to try to map areas where they might be particularly vulnerable in Pound Ridge. So this map shows in, let's see, in the orange shows areas, road stretches that are close, within 750 feet of vernal pools. The bright pink shows even higher priority stretches of road that are within that distance of two or more pools. Oh, really? Yeah. So you have a bunch of vernal pools here, and that have a bunch, quite a lot of upland forests as well. So these are areas where amphibians are going to be trying to travel between the forests and pools. So we mapped these kind of priority road stretches throughout Pound Ridge. These are areas where you might see the greatest amphibian crossings and the greatest mortality, and are therefore areas where volunteers might want to concentrate their efforts if there are to be volunteers helping with amphibian crossings. And the DEC does have a program to assist with that. So I'll touch on one more habitat quickly. I'm sure I'm running over on time. Another kind of special wetland and a priority habitat that we found in Pound Ridge are fens. Fens are an unusual kind of herb and shrub dominated wetland that are fed by calcareous groundwater seepage. They're similar to a wet meadow, but they do have that seepage, and they're usually also high pH calcareous areas. Fens are special partly because they usually support distinctive plant communities, which can include at least 12 state-listed plant species in our region, as well as numerous regionally rare species of plants. We recommend a conservation zone of 300 feet, at least 300 feet from fens. We mapped 12 fens in Pound Ridge. Most of them are pretty small, but still significant. Most fens in our area in general are pretty small. The fens here are in the bright orange. I'll zoom in. The darker orange are the fens. The 300 feet conservation zone is the lighter orange. And then finally, there's an area of concern that goes out 750 meters from the fen edge. That's the orange hatching. So all the fens in Pound Ridge, as you can see, are in one area. It's this marble area that also has the calcareous outcrops west of the Trinity Lake. So we recommend, if it's of interest to the town, to protect fens directly from direct development or disturbance, to protect wetlands within that 300 feet conservation zone from draining, ditching, or impoundment, from use of pesticides or herbicides, from mowing or cutting of vegetation. This is one of the special fen plants, the Grassia parnassus, which we found in Pound Ridge. And that's all I have. I'll hand it back to Gretchen. Oh, I don't know if I have time.
Chris, we're not gonna get kicked out, and you have a rapt audience, so,
Well, I don't want to keep you. I can mention streams quickly, sure. So, another of our priority habitats in Pound Ridge are streams. We have both perennial and intermittent streams. As you can see here, the streams are the blue lines, obviously. And we have stream conservation zones, which are intended to preserve areas around the streams within 250 meters of perennial streams and 50 meters of intermittent streams. And so you can see these conservation zones cover a large part of the town. They're meant to protect habitats of organisms such as the wood turtle, which uses streams with certain conditions, certain types of stream banks for breeding. For most of its foraging and overwintering needs. But it also uses surrounding forests and meadows. Uses the meadows for nesting. And so that's why we have a conservation zone to incorporate not only the streams and the stream banks, but the surrounding habitats. So in these areas, the town could consider wood turtles and streams whenever activities are being proposed. Obviously, in such large areas, it would be very difficult to prevent all development. But it's worth considering streams and wood turtles in those areas. And there's one of these areas, the Miamis River Gorge, which is, as I said before, quite undeveloped log forest there. And another important stream corridor along the Stonehill River, another perennial stream in town. And I will skip these and turn it over to Gretchen.
Yes, we're going to say just a little bit about how you all might use the habitat information that's on the map itself and in the report. Yeah, good. If you are a landowner, for example, the habitat map will illustrate the kinds of habitats around your land. You might be very familiar with many of them, but the report may also describe some aspects of those habitats that you may be unfamiliar with. The report explains many of the ecological values of these habitats and their sensitivities to disturbance, and provides lots of recommendations for land management that can help you maintain habitat connections to adjacent properties, maintain wildlife movement corridors, help you manage your land in ways that will encourage groundwater recharge to protect streams and wetlands and other water bodies and the groundwater itself. If you are a developer, the habitat map will show you what kinds of habitats are present, and the report can help you figure out where to locate a new project, how to design your new project so that you are avoiding and buffering the most sensitive areas, how to maintain habitat connections with the larger landscape, how to minimize habitat fragmentation, and some ideas about and including the importance of designing stormwater management, so that there is maximum groundwater recharge and minimum damage to nearby wetlands and streams. If you are on the staff of the Land Trust or another conservation organization that deals with land, the habitat map and the report will point out where some of the most special and unusual habitats are in the town. You can see where some of the best wildlife movement corridors are, and that might be something that is increasingly important in the changing climate when lots of organisms are needing to move to cooler areas. The map and report will help you identify places that may be most important to landscape resilience in general, to the effects of climate change. If you're working with a landowner to design a conservation easement, the map can help you figure out what parts of a property may be best to set aside for future conservation, what parts may be most suited to a new house or other development, if that is part of the plan. And the map can also help you, and the report can help you figure out what places may be most important for new land acquisition for conservation should those opportunities arise. If you're on a town agency, like a planning board or a town board, zoning board, or a town committee that's dealing with planning or local legislation, the map and report are especially well suited to town-wide conservation planning and to developing revisions to the zoning ordinance that may be more protective of the places that you deem to be most important. We really hope that the habitat map report will become routine parts of the reviews, environmental reviews of new development projects. That's a use that we always have in mind when we're putting together these projects. The report is full of recommendations. Some of the recommendations are very specific to particular kinds of habitats, and some of them are more general to a geographic area of the town or the whole town. Chris mentioned some of the kinds of recommendations that we put forth, and some of them are pretty basic, like protecting habitat areas in large lots and minimizing habitat fragmentation. That is one of the most important things you can do if you are concerned about maintaining the populations, the wildlife populations that have been here for probably thousands of years, and we hope will be there for a few more thousand years. The more they have large, unbroken habitat areas, the more likely you are to keep a lot of those species here. Protecting areas around and near vernal pools and fens, for the reasons that Chris mentioned. Maintaining forests along streams wherever possible. Forests are one of the best kind of land cover for maintaining the cool, clean water that many of our stream organisms need. Minimizing use of pesticides and fertilizers on lawns and gardens, especially when you're near some of the more sensitive habitats, wetlands of any kind, streams, and especially wetlands like fens. Fens are extremely sensitive to fertilizer, for example, for anything that will raise the nutrient concentrations in the fen. That will change the plant community and render it unsuitable for many of the rare species that occupy our fens. A general recommendation is to keep new development near possible, and that's in contrast to, you know, a long driveway that winds deep into the forest. You know, even a single driveway to a single house can be a huge fragmenting feature. And the more that you can keep everything near existing roads, near other development, the more you'll be able to preserve large blocks of habitat that are so important to maintaining, especially our most sensitive wildlife species. And there are many, many more recommendations. We do hope that you will all delve deeply into the habitat report and find lots of other ways to use the information on your own land and in the work that you're doing in your organizations and for the town. So that's much of what we wanted to say, and we'd be very happy to answer questions. Yes?
To what extent has SONIA brought climate change into their analyses, Pound Ridge in particular, but in general?
Yeah, well, climate change is something that we are thinking about all the time. It doesn't actually affect the way we identify and map habitats or describe them. But we do mention in the report, in many locations, the ways that the habitats can help to mitigate climate change in some cases, can help to store carbon in the above ground and below ground biomass and in the soils. Forests, and you are blessed with many forests here, or large areas of forests. Forests can have a great effect at just cooling local air temperatures, moderating air temperatures actually in both summer and winter. So climate change is sort of at the front of our minds all the time. Maintaining natural areas, maintaining them in sort of high functioning condition is a very good sort of approach to helping us all adjust to and respond to the changing climate. Yes, Deborah?
Gretchen, when you talk about keeping development near existing roads, do you have a distance that you or you would recommend?
I guess I would say the closer the better. But that doesn't mean that every place has to be right on the road.
Mm-hmm.
And I know, of course, there are advantages to having some, visual barrier between a new house or a cluster of houses and the road, and that's fine. But 100 feet, 100-foot driveway or 300-foot driveway is better than a 1,000-foot driveway. When we're thinking about concerned about forest fragmentation, for example. So I guess I would just say the closer the better, and it's it will vary from site to site depending on the topography and how much visual screening you want to achieve from the road.
There's no magic number for that.
No magic number. Yes, is it?
Get my voice. I forgot, I'm sitting behind the fan output.
Oh, yeah. Well, we can turn this off.
Not a problem.
Yeah.
My house is on a fairly small piece of land for Pound Ridge, it's only 2 acres. But I'm surrounded on 2 sides by 10 acres of town open space. And I learned, I not only have the upland forest, I have the talus that you were talking about, I have the vernal pond. And this year I finally discovered what an ash tree was when I suddenly found a clearing in this 10.5-acre piece of property next to me. And I'm wondering what the effect is not only climate change, but the loss of ash trees and beech trees.
And hemlock.
And hemlocks driving, well, my hemlocks at least are spring, only a Delgia, but the others
Yeah.
have been decimated just this
cracks that are created could allow invasive species
Because
to
there was
come
never
in.
any sunlight, and now big patches of sunlight in this 10-acre.
Yes. So we do expect big changes. The whole character of the forest is likely to change, not just from the invasive insects and diseases that you mentioned. You know, deer have been changing the forest actually for several decades now.
Quite deer on that.
Quite
It's amazing, I was astounded at what you can find in just this 10-acre piece of property.
Yeah, as Chris mentioned, these openings in the forest canopy are likely to invite invasive shrub species, and that's something to look out for. If we do recommend that if you have a place that's essentially uninfested, uninvaded so far by non-native invasive shrubs like multiflora rose or Eurasian honeysuckle or Japanese barberry, privet, keep an eye on places where the canopy is opened up and try to remove things as they come. We certainly don't recommend toxic control methods, but you know, digging, pulling, and repeated cutting and that sort of thing.
I wonder how much of the spread of this, I can just see it with, when the town comes through and plows and mows along the sides of the roads. Now all the stilt grass and the marsh marigold, no. It's not, but it's the one that looks like the marsh marigold.
Right.
That's your celandine.
Well,
That's your celandine.
the celandine, yeah.
Yes.
It has just taken over the land.
Yes, disturbance like that often invites invasives. One of the best ways to prevent invasives is to keep your forests especially undisturbed.
Right.
And the less disturbance, the better. The disturbance of the soil, opening up of the canopy, many of our non-natives from Eurasia take very rapid advantage of those conditions. Yes.
Hi, I just wanted to know, protecting some of the areas that you mentioned, such as vernal pools, the 750 feet, does that include walking? Do walking trails? How do walking trails fit in with it?
You're talking about, is that a...
Protecting the areas that
Yeah.
need protecting, does that mean excluding walking trails, or are they allowed?
Yeah, walking trails I don't think would be a big problem near vernal pools. The roads and driveways are, because the amphibians need to cross those regularly to get to and from their breeding and non-breeding habitats. A walking trail, as long as you watch where you're going.
And vernal pool makes an excellent place to visit on a hike.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
I have a question about a location, and I guess it's the corner of 121 and 137. There's a swamp that all the trees are dead, but there are several, I don't know, 20 nests up in the dead trees. Does anyone know who's nesting there?
Were they water?
That's the blue heron river.
Yeah.
That's the blue heron river.
We all know.
Over to see, but I'm driving back. Oh, okay, blue heron.
Yeah, people flooded the area, and that can be.
There were about
Nesting
30
its nests.
functioning nests. This year there were not as many.
Because they're being neatly birds, they need to be up and protected from the land.
Go there in the spring when the
That might be Bedford. That might be Bedford.
Yes, and that is, as some of you have mentioned, those certainly would be great blue heron nests. Great blue herons often come in a beaver impoundment. The impoundment is what kills the trees, the standing water. And this beaver and great blue heron are very closely tied to each other. Once the impoundment is there and the trees have died, the herons will often come in and create a rookery, a whole collection of nests. They might be there for a few years or for many years. Once the water subsides, if the dam is breached or the beaver or the water subsides, the herons will disappear. They rely on the water to help protect their nests from predators. Yeah, so it's a very nice little relationship there.
Yeah, and after that happens, after the herons leave, you sometimes will have great horned owls move in and use the nests. They don't build their own nests.
Yes.
Next to the town park, there seems to be somewhat of a migratory thing going on with the turtles across the road, and you talked about how to deal with preventing the massacre of turtles. What would you recommend for the hill coming down right in front of the town park? Because that tends to be in the spring or in the time when I'm seeing baby turtles or even turtles crawling across my property. I'm going into the town park.
Turtle crossing.
Turtle crossing sign. I mean, what are we supposed to do? I mean,
That's a very difficult problem. Roads are huge sources of turtle mortality. Huge. Where turtles in the spring, the females need to move from their winter wetland area into their uplands nesting areas. And that often requires crossing roads, crossing driveways, crossing lawns, crossing crop fields, other dangerous places, and great many get killed on those migrations to and from their nesting areas. That happens in the spring, and then in the late summer, the hatchlings come out, and they're trying to make their way into a nearby wetland, and they're also extremely vulnerable.
Unfortunately, the turtle crossings aren't nearly as predictable as the amphibian crossings, or as concentrated, so harder to get volunteers out at the right moment to help.
That's right. That's right. The breeding migrations generally happen in June, late May, June, sometimes into early July. The hatchlings hatch out in the latter part of August usually, and through September into early October. So it's a long season. You're not going to be closing off your roads at that time.
It also seems to be during the day that you get a lot of throughout the day that you get a lot of turtle crossings. Where frogs and salamanders, it's definitely after dark.
Yeah. So what can you do? Signs, very bold signs. I don't know, speed bumps. I know those wouldn't be viable for some roads.
Speed bumps are another possibility. I don't know the location that you're describing.
it's right, the town park.
It's actually this road, yeah.
It's actually this road that we're on that we just go down right at the bottom. We have had turtles coming across onto our property heading up the hill. I mean,
yeah, I know where you mean.
There are places where people have successfully installed tunnels on the roads for turtles, but that is a tricky thing to do and to do it properly. You need to have some way to sort of funnel the turtles to that location, and it would take some real doing and some real understanding of the site by a specialist to be able to design something like that properly. And you also kind of need to know where are their nesting sites, where are they actually nesting, so that you can identify the corridors that they're likely to be moving through. It's a tricky proposition. I don't know if that site would be suitable for something like that.
And unfortunately, it's also one of the most heavily trafficked places in town. You have the town park traffic itself, and then you have workers going from Ridgefield to Stanford and vice versa all day long. So that makes it a lot more difficult than some of the, a lot of the side roads where, you can get some volunteers out. And, there isn't that much traffic that you have to deal with.
And is it so heavily trafficked and speedy that speed bumps would be impossible there?
No, you wouldn't.
Yeah, it wasn't.
You can't get people to obey the 30-mile-an-hour zone.
As it is.
It's the major road in town.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's just, it's an unfortunate situation. If you're, you know, if you know a little more about where the turtles are actually nesting, you might be able to figure out what, you know, the precise ways that they travel there.
Well, it sounds like you have a pretty good idea of where they
I mean,
travel.
we
You
thought,
look right
we
there.
thought, our son had ridden his bike and destroyed the lawn, but it was literally a path 3 feet wide of the turtle coming up, on the lawn heading up north. It was amazing.
I know, it's unbelievable.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
I just wonder, this winter, or this spring, all of a sudden all the chipmunks disappeared. Does anybody know?
They're all over on my property.
It's not that I miss them because they eat all the seeds, but, but all of a sudden there were no chipmunks.
Do you have more hawks?
Yes, we have a red.
That's why you have fewer children. One of the reasons for fewer children.
Well,
Well, it could be, I'm interested to hear that, because I think in general in the region, this has been a huge year for chipmunks and gray squirrels.
oh, they come back, and the squirrels too kind of disappeared.
Yeah.
I thought it was an extraordinarily high population up where I live, which is a few counties north of here.
The last year we had an enormous number.
You did. That is interesting. I mean, this idea of a big predator there, if you have hawks around, they could be taking them off. But I don't know how else to
We don't know.
explain that. That's interesting.
Yeah, we had a black bear visit last year. We're right up behind Scott's Corners off Barnegat Road. And of course, there's a bird feeder that attracted him. But where do they hang out? I mean, is there a den? I mean, where do they live? Where are their dens? I would think in this built-up area, they would not survive crossing roads, you know?
Yeah.
We have a den where we live.
Oh.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And do the bears overwinter there?
I can't swear that they overwinter, but I have met them frequently, so I'm assuming that they're back there. And it's a perfect area. I've got a stone that you would love. I could just fabulous.
Oh.
I have a thing just back over there and everything else.
I think bears can deal with a surprising amount of roads and suburban development. They would need some forest patches for their dens, but there are plenty of forest patches.
There's so many rock outcroppings in Pound Ridge.
Yeah, I think they would have plenty of habitat there.
There are a lot of caves.
They do seek out for their winter places, some places that are, you know, somewhat apart from high activity areas ordinarily. There are exceptions to that. So they might, you know, look for a place that doesn't have any foot traffic or vehicle traffic. I think there is probably a huge amount of good habitat for them here. Yes.
The habitat report, does that get updated if there are areas that should be on it that aren't already on it? Is that possible?
Well, it certainly is possible. I think what's more likely than updating the report would be updating the map. If you could confirm that there are new habitats that were undiscovered at this time and are discovered.
I mean amendments.
Yes, and, you know, I do think that the habitat map though will be fairly, current for a long time. Most of the habitats do not change quickly. And, you know, 20 years from now, probably a lot will look just as it looks now, you know, except for, you know, newly developed areas, of course. But, and some things will change slightly. You don't have a lot of shrubland, say, or even meadows of great size in Pound Ridge, but those are two habitats that do, if they're unmanaged, they slowly transition to other habitats. A meadow will transition to a shrubland will transition to a forest. That kind of thing could, create a different look on the map. But there's no, they would have, the town would, if they wanted to do an update of the map and the report, could find some funding. It wouldn't have to be a large amount to do some updates. We have done that in other towns. Sometimes the updating is just remotely. We just look at aerial photographs and map out the new developed areas, so that those areas that once were habitats are now would feel like.
I'm asking because we have a large wetland in our area and also an intermittent stream. And if they enter the stream enters into a pond, and the pond road is there. And it's not on the map.
It's not on this map?
No, it's not on the map.
And the pond isn't?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
But I mean, I may not have been able to see it.
Yeah. Well, we assume that we have missed a number of things out there. And a new mapping or an updating of the mapping could bring some of those in. I want to say one other thing about the map. The map does show lots of wetlands, many more than you would find on other public maps, publicly available maps created either by the state or the federal government. This mapping is done in a lot more detail than those maps. As Chris said, though, we're not out there with soil augers and surveying equipment. The map is not suitable for determining the jurisdictional limits of any wetland. The map of wetlands and all the other habitats are just sketches.
Quite good sketches.
They're quite good sketches, but they're not suitable for to be put onto a site plan. But they will give you a very good idea of where your wetlands are and your streams. The map shows many more streams than you would find in other maps, other publicly available maps, and I hope you'll take advantage of that. Both streams and wetlands are much more comprehensively represented on this map than on other maps.
Yeah, it's important to realize too that the planning board and the water control commission require mapping on the property, and they also walk the site because you really need to field test it.
Absolutely.
Right, absolutely.
And that would be a time when new habitats could be discovered. There would be a vernal pool that we missed, for example. And those are important.
One last question? All right. Thank you, Gretchen and Chris. It's so nice to be live again. More bodies and people.
And Carrie, thank you for organizing and the funding and just motivating the whole project. You're a superwoman.
I don't know about that, but it was a lift. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, they've been But this is recommendations, this is not code. You need code. Without code, there's the concept of biological corridor is the land area that is large and live there. So the Fort Mountain Bridge is a refuge area, okay, where animals, plants, and animals can successfully breed. And then you corridor is an absolute to another area around kitchen. Those features you have to get is that besides these large fragmented areas, it was mapped out, it's a concept that was put out by Michael Clemens, a biologist. We have a report on the website. It's a concept. If you post three communities that established these corridors, but they did never. So it didn't get off the right path. But it is something.